I'm Nahlah Ayed, host of CBC Ideas. This federal election campaign has been overshadowed by one overarching issue. How do we as Canadians deal with Donald Trump? That has left little space to discuss other important matters like how do we revitalize our democracy? In our series, Ideas for a Better Canada, we held public discussions in 4 cities in search of local ideas that can inspire national change. Burlington, on the shores of Lake Ontario, is a picturesque, quiet city just down the road from Toronto that, over the next few years, is projected to grow at an unprecedented rate. It's home to the Burlington Public Library, which, like other public libraries across Canada, is at the front line of the fight for intellectual freedom, serving to remind Canadians what democracy is all about.
My name's Lita, and I have the privilege of being the CEO here at Burlington Public Library. I didn't expect to be in this moment where core values and concepts like intellectual freedom would be challenged at such a base level in so many different ways. But I think as a sector, and we are really trying to rise to the opportunity and really reinforce the core role that libraries play in terms of upholding our democracy and how critical intellectual freedom is as one of our core values.
Let's talk about that. As you say, intellectual freedom is a core value of public libraries, and it's baked right into your official policy. What does it promise exactly?
I think that is really one of the pieces that's sort of being questioned is the lack of potentially across our democracy a shared understanding of what intellectual freedom means. That idea that everyone should have the right to access information, and at the same time, that shared right and responsibility that none of us has the role to dictate how someone else might choose to select or access information. And as an institution, we try and balance those two roles. So we want to offer a collection with breadth and scope so that everyone will find something that they need, but recognizing that everything in our collection might not be for everyone, and reserving the rights for people to self-select is what is appropriate to them, but to not dictate what is right for another person.
I want to just give a glimpse of the diversity of voices that appear on your shelves. And so the online BPL catalog lists the recent memoir, for example, by infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci, who promoted public health efforts and vaccinations in the US during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the library also carries a recent book by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. that argues that Anthony Fauci was part of a global conspiracy and questions the efficacy of vaccines. As you can imagine, the community comments are very lively. Why include both books? And Meg, I'll start with you. Why include both books in your collection?
Sure. I think if we don't have both books, we don't have that broad understanding of both scopes of that topic. People are interested to read from both sides of that topic. Whether they agree with it or not, they want to know what's being said. I think one of the fundamental things that we do in the library is we don't judge beforehand how somebody is going to read a book. We have the information available, we have access to it so that people can read it and receive the information that's in it, and then they can determine for themselves how they're going to respond to that information. If we remove some of those items, we don't give people the opportunity to even be able to experience it.
So tell me about that. If someone comes in the door and says, I find this book offensive, why are you carrying it? Walk me through what happens next. What do you do?
So what folks are really trying to do in those conversations is start it from a place of good intent. We're not going to assume that someone's coming in because they really want to see something not in our library. They're often just curious about why we have it in our libraries.
I understand that when you receive a complaint, you actually use the word democracy. And I'm wondering, one, how that sits with the complainants, and two, just explain why you go that deeply into the reasoning behind what you're doing.
I think that the key things around freedom of thought, freedom of expression are really this concept of choice and access. And those are such important pieces in democracy. I think when you're living in a community where there is the ability to see people around you that are not like you. You want to be able to interact in a place where you have lots of choice and lots of different viewpoints, and then the ability to access those materials as well. So I think those are kind of the parts that connect it back to democracy.
Yeah, the book that I was going to mention is If You're a Drag Queen and You Know It,
Right.
is a children's picture book written by the founder of Drag Queen Storytime. Could you speak to, Meg, what it is that, if someone came to you with a complaint about that book, which I understand some have, what it is that you outline in terms of the necessity of having that book in your shelves?
Right. I mean, first of all, it's a picture book. So it is designed in a way to be fun, colorful. It is based on a song, If You're Happy and You Know It. So a lot of the themes within the book are really meant to be something that a parent could interact with their child, or that the child could interact with themselves in a fun way. In terms of that concept of why somebody would even ask for us to not have that book in the library, I think in so many ways people are looking at it through a single lens. They're looking at it through, I wouldn't want my child to read that, so why would I let other people read that? Or they're looking at it through, this might teach my child about something that I don't want them to learn about. I think what's missing in that is there are different styles of learning, there's different styles of parenting, and there's different ways that people access pieces of that knowledge. So in terms of like that particular book, I think it's that just because one person doesn't feel it's right for them, it doesn't mean that other parents don't feel that it's right for their children. And the fact that we have something like that in the library is really so that we are able to provide that choice to our community for the types of materials that they want to use.
When you have a book on a shelf, it's one thing, but then when you have the author in, you have several events a year of people discussing various topics, some of them very contentious. You must have complaints come in through those. I'm wondering just what your approach is. How do you, is there an example that you can point to and tell us how it is that you de-escalate these kinds of situations?
So our most recent example is we had an event a couple of weeks ago with writer and journalist Omar El-Akkad. And so his presence in the library did bring some concern on the part of some community members. And the event was really in relation to a new book that he has released that is very much a personal memoir based on his experience as a journalist and as a writer. But again, coming to this moment, as human beings, we all have a breadth of belief, a breadth of experience. We are all multifaceted people that live full lives. And so when someone Googles a person's name and sees a part of their belief or a part of their experience, the assumption that that's what's going to be represented in the library event is something that we really talk with people about. And again, intellectual freedom is not an easy concept, and it involves, challenging conversations. And when people express concern about things that we're offering at the library, part of our process is really ensuring that people feel heard and listened to, and that they have an opportunity to share their position about why they might disagree with us having a particular author, and from that point being able to really have that conversation about why, and acknowledging that not all of our events are intended for everyone in the community. Understandably, there may be some individuals in our community who are not interested in hearing Omar speak and hearing about his new book. But again, it comes back to that premise of not precluding other people from having that experience, and what we can all learn as a community by getting a little bit more comfortable with listening to perspectives that might be different than our own, and listening to lived experience that might be very different from our own as well.
We're shortly going to go to audience questions. People might have questions for you about this process, but I do want to ask both of you before we go on that, as you say, the idea of intellectual freedom, applying it as a framework, is something that needs to be learned, maybe. Mm-hmm. It's not something that you know intrinsically. And it's necessary for professionally for librarians, but from your experience here on the front lines of promoting and protecting intellectual freedom and democracy, Could this way that you look at books and navigating these differences inform the rest of us in society? What can we learn? What lessons could we take away from how you navigate difference and complaints for us to do the exact same thing in a larger society?
Sure.
Meg?
Yeah, I think the first piece is it's uncomfortable. This isn't something that just comes easily, and we don't always get it right. I think part of it is being brave to engage in some conversations sometimes, being brave to stand in your own values or the values that you believe in. But then I think in terms of what we do at the library is seeing others as humans, treating people with dignity and respect, regardless of what the argument that they have or the belief system that they have. We are very we treat privacy and impartiality really importantly in the library as well. So the idea of like passing judgment on someone just because they happen to take a certain book out of the library, that's part of what we learn in our core is not something that we want to be doing. I think when you translate that into what we see in society, be patient with others, treat people with respect, and listen.
After the break, we'll continue our discussion of intellectual freedom and the political process. We continue our conversation in Burlington, Ontario about intellectual freedom and the political process. Joining me now is Ira Wells. He's a journalist and academic and the author of a new work, a book-length argument, really, called On Book Banning, or How the New Censorship Consensus Trivializes Art and Undermines Democracy. Ira, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We've heard about book challenges at libraries. How much of a problem is book banning? How much of an actual threat it is in Canada?
Well, maybe we should start with just defining what book banning is.
Sure.
Book banning is the removal of a title from the library shelves because someone considers it harmful. That's the definition that comes from the American Library Association and that we use here. I first became aware of book banning as something that was happening in the United States. And that brand of book banning is also happening in Canada. We are seeing LGBTQ books being challenged across the country. Places like Chilliwack, BC, there was an RCMP investigation into child porn on the shelves. Turned out not to be the case. But you mentioned Valley View earlier. This is happening in Canada, and it's also happening from the other political perspective in Canada, and we can get into this. But there was a case in Peel Region in 2023 where Peel Region, the school board, had pulled thousands of books from their library shelves, had removed those titles from the shelves because they were considered harmful. So just to briefly wrap up, why I call this the new censorship consensus is that we have these two very different political orientations, these evangelicals or populists, primarily rooted in the American South, and you have progressive educators in Ontario who could not apparently be more different, and yet they both see books as fields of contagion. They see libraries as fields of contagion and books as sources of harm to students and to young people. And they propose the same solution, which is to ban them.
Okay. It's really curious, and I'm sure this is a question that's on people's minds. You know, we do live in a very digital world. Much of what we do is online, much of what we read is online. What is it about actual books and libraries that's gotten, has it upset people on both sides of the political spectrum, or all sides of the political spectrum?
Yeah, well, it feels like a bit of a paradox, doesn't it? Because
it does.
There's something called the American Time Use Survey, where they survey people on how much time they spend doing any given thing. And when you look at the student age, the high school student age, so students age 15 to 19, I'm glad you're seated to hear this, but apparently the average high school age student spends about 9 minutes a day reading versus 4.5 hours with on their cell phones. So when you take that in, and you might ask yourself, well, why is book banning why are we so worked up about books? Why wouldn't we be more concerned with the media that they are actually consuming? But I think the answer is that that social media, it feels so chaotic, it feels so ephemeral, it's here, it's gone. If you're upset about it, what do you do? Where do you go? Where do you protest? The school library is a stable place. It has physical books that you can remove and fight over. And so it's doing different kinds of work. It is when you go and the people who are agitating for book bans, yes, part of it is about removing the books from the shelves, but there's also this kind of symbolic violence going on, which is to say that it's about coming together against a scapegoat, an imagined other, and it's about allowing that political community to cohere through that symbolic violence.
I want to ask you this. Everybody today is talking about free speech and freedom of expression. Everyone from tech bros to the far right, the Trump administration demands it even as they're enacting censorship and restricting citizen access to information. Has that expression, freedom of expression, lost its meaning?
It has been tainted by hypocrites. The tech bro contingent is immensely corrosive to free speech and intellectual freedom. Donald Trump's Department of Education, which may not be much longer for this world, but at the end of January released a press release saying that they were ending Joe Biden's book ban hoax. And if you can unpack that for a second, what that means is that you may have all been hearing about this book banning stuff, but it's all just a hoax. There's no books that are being banned. It's pornography that's been being banned. It's LGBTQ indoctrination that's been being banned. So in other words, go for it. Book banning is now becoming a state-sponsored practice in a way that it hasn't been for 50, 60 years.
This is a good moment for anyone who wants to ask Ira some questions. Someone with a question? Great. Please, go right ahead.
Hi there. So I wanted to kind of talk about the irony of right-wing views on indoctrination and how the right-wing belief that, queer literature, LGBTQ plus literature is indoctrinating children. However, without the recognition that right-wing people are often indoctrinating youth in the opposite direction, and just the recognition or the assumption that only left-wing views are kind of indoctrinating in that way, and their own right-wing beliefs aren't indoctrinating in the opposite manner. Do you have any suggestions for, personally as an educator or as parents, community members, in speaking with people who have opposing political views in that way, ways to help kind of expand their view of this isn't indoctrination, this is education, going back to that difference, and teaching kids specifically empathy and how to critically analyze a text and an idea rather than indoctrinating them and promoting one specific viewpoint?
Thank you. Great question. What's your advice?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that we need to, in the field of education and also in many areas of civil society and just across our culture, we need to create space for, we need to create a kind of non-political space, which is to say that, over the last few years, we have, for understandable reasons, we have cranked up the rhetoric so that everything is an existential question all the time. Every election is like the last election or the most important election of our lifetimes, and everything is always to the extreme. And that licenses us to sacrifice our ideals in favor of what we think is the necessary political outcome. That, in other words, if we allow speech that we disagree with, maybe it's questioning our right to exist, or it's questioning a group's right to exist, and we don't have the luxury of free speech anymore. I think we need to tone it down to remind ourselves of our ideals and to try to live up to them. In education, I think what this particularly means is again, reaffirming the idea that we are here to provide children with the building blocks so that they can learn and think critically for themselves and develop their own opinions. We are not going to feed them the opinions, right? We are here to provide them with the intellectual equipment and the toolkit so that they can start to make some judgments for themselves at some stage. We're not just here to intravenously inject the opinions into them.
Thank you very, very much. Have a wonderful evening. See you again sometime soon. Ideas for a Better Canada is a partnership with the Samara Centre for Democracy. To hear even more of those conversations, please listen to CBC Ideas on broadcast or podcast, or visit us at cbc.ca/bettercanada. A big thank you to the CBC Call Out Partnership Program for making this series possible. And thank you for tuning in.